II, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt proved to be a tough, rugged, and reliable fighter airplane that was one of the United States' primary fighter and ground support aircraft. But by late 1944, the writing was on the wall as far as prop-driven aircraft were concerned. Jets were coming, and Republic's chief designer, Alexander Kartveli, knew it. So he began work on a jet power replacement for the P-47. He initially tried redesigning the P-47 to just accommodate a jet engine, but this proved futile due to the early jet engine's large size. So he designed a new streamlined fighter jet from scratch. On September 11, 1944, the U.S. Army Air Force released a general request for a day fighter with a top speed of 600 miles per hour, a combat radius of 705 miles, and an armament of either 6 50 caliber guns or 4 15mm guns. In addition, the new aircraft had to use the new GE TG-180 axial turbojet engine, which would be produced as the Allison J-35. In November of 1944, Republic received an order for 3 prototypes of the new XP-84, and since Republic had extensive experience designing single-seat fighters and promised the performance would exceed Lockheed's P-80 Shooting Star, no competition was even held for the contract, and before the aircraft ever even took flight, the contract was expanded to 25 service test YP-84As and 75 production P-84As. The plane already had production orders, but Windtunnel testing by the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics showed that the plane had issues. Longitudinal stability was a serious concern, and stabilizer skin buckling at high speeds was also found to be a problem. Also, Republic had used some of the same internal structural supports that they had used in the prop P-47, but under the loads of a jet aircraft could put on the airframe, the older structure designs were just not strong enough to hold up. This wasn't a design issue only by Republic, though. It was an issue across the entire aircraft industry. Many airframe engineers struggled with the new stresses and demands of jet power that put on aircraft. And all of this was not even mentioning the weight of the plane kept increasing during development and testing. And finally, the U.S. Army Air Force had to sign a gross weight limit for the new fighter of 13,400 pounds. The engine was later upgraded to the more powerful J-35 GE-15 engine to help propel the new bloated aircraft. On February 28, 1946, the first prototype flew at Merrick Army Airfield, and later in August, a second prototype arrived. Both planes had upgraded engines. But due to delays with delivery of jet engine and slow production of the XP-84As, the plane had undergone only limited flight testing by the time production model P-84As rolled out of the factory in 1947. This would prove to be a huge issue very soon, as the planes were plagued with some serious problems. In fact, the entire F-84 program was nearly canceled over these issues. The planes were armed with 650 caliber machine guns and could carry 35 5-inch rockets or 2,000 pounds of bombs or napalm. The Allison J-35 engines produced 4,900 pounds of thrust, and the plane had a maximum speed of 620 miles per hour and a ceiling of 43,240 feet. Once the planes began to arrive at their air bases and assigned to fighter groups, problems started immediately, and restrictions were placed on the aircraft due to structural failures in the control surfaces and the fuselage. On top of these issues, there was also a large parts shortage to repair the damaged aircraft, and in late May of 1948, the entire fleet of F-84s was grounded. An official review of the aircraft was done that year and concluded that none of the variants of the F-84 aircraft could be considered operational or capable of executing any aspect of their intended mission. Extensive upgrades were in order, and the Air Force spent $8 million fixing the issues in the plane. But despite these upgrades, the in-service rates for F-84s remain very poor, usually with less than half of the fleet operational any given time. This was primarily due to the shortage of parts for the Allison engines. The expectation was for each F-84 to be able to fly for 25 hours each month, with 100 hours between engine overhauls. But the actual hours in Korea and NATO operations far outpaces Allison's ability to supply spare parts. Also hurting the F-84, like most other early jets, was the takeoff performance. It was absolutely abysmal. During summers in Korea, with a full combat load, it wasn't uncommon for F-84s to need 10,000 feet of runway to get off the ground. Rocket-assisted takeoff canisters were often strapped to F-84s to help them get off the ground quicker and with less runway. Pilots had actually nicknamed the plane the ground-loving whore due to its seeming lack of want to climb off the ground during takeoffs. The acceleration of the plane was quick once it was in the air, though. It could reach its Mach .82 limit pretty quickly, even at low altitudes. The plane had enough power to fly faster, but exceeding its Mach limit resulted in the plane violently pitching up and causing its wings to shear off. Above 15,000 feet, the plane could be flown faster, but severe buffeting still happened to it. The speed limit on the plane was a big issue when it was in air-to-air combat against MiG-15s over Korea. Not only was the plane slower than the MiGs, but it also was less maneuverable. One F-84 pilot credited with 2 MiG-15 kills actually got his second kill by flying his aircraft into a pitch up. The MiG-15 following him wasn't able to perform the violent maneuver and crashed into the ground. And luckily for the pilot of the F-84, it didn't disintegrate upon this maneuver. The airplane suffered massive warping during the maneuver though. During Korea, the F-84Bs and F-84Cs could not enter service due to the fact their engines only had a 40-hour service life. The F-84D and E, however, entered combat with the 27th Fighter Escort Group in December of 1950. The F-84s were originally tasked with escorting B-29s, and the first air-to-air victory for the F-84 was secured on January 21st, 1951, but at the cost of 2 F-84s. And the F-84s soon demonstrated they were outmatched by the MiG-15s, and soon the MiG counter missions were handed off to the much more capable and maneuverable swept-wing F-86 Sabres. But for everything the F-84 lacked in comparison to the F-86 Sabre, maintainability had improved to the point that mechanics were very appreciative of the airplane. The F-86 had an awkward engine swap process, but the F-84 could have its engine swapped in half an hour when done by skilled mechanics. Republic, despite its original design flaws for its jet fighter, had extensive experience in building a serviceable aircraft, and this was every bit as important as a fast and agile airplane. They had built a complete system of quick disconnect hoses, fuel lines, engine mounts, and engine trolleys that supplemented the planes and made maintenance quick and efficient to perform. They had over 180 access panels along the airplane too. Pilots also found the plane to be quite rugged. Many planes suffered anti-aircraft flak hits, large holes blown in the wings or fuselage, and still made it back to base. The F-84s were moved to low-level interdiction roll, basically shooting and pounding the ground targets from the air. This is a job that it absolutely excelled at. The most notable example of its ability to rain terror on ground targets was the raid on Soiho Dam complex in June 1952. 84 Thunderjets attacked and obliterated 90% of the dam, knocking out electricity to the entire Korean peninsula for 2 weeks. Again in 1953, F-84s attacked dams at Toksan and Chosun, which caused massive floods and destroyed bridges, railway lines, and roads. The plane ended the Korean War with 86,408 missions flown, in which they dropped 55,427 tons of bombs, 6,129 tons of napalm, and the U.S. Air Force claimed that the F-84s were responsible for almost 60% of all ground targets that were destroyed in the entire war. But showing its lack of ability against MiGs, the F-84s were credited with damaging or destroyed 105 MiG-15s during the war, but only 7 or 8 of them were actually shot down from the sky. The rest were just destroyed on the ground. A total of 335 F-84s were lost during the war. Around 135 were lost to anti-aircraft fire, and approximately 20 were shot down by MiG-15s. In addition to its proud service as one of the best ground support aircraft the U.S. has ever employed, the F-84 also has a few historical notches on its belt to be proud of. For one, it was the first fighter with built-in mid-air refueling equipment, and it was also the first fighter to be able to carry a nuclear bomb. It was also the first aircraft to be flown by the U.S. Air Force Thunderbirds from 1953 to 1955. In 1954, the F-84F, which was a swept-wing version of the plane, was called the Thunderstreak, but due to budget constraints, the Air Force never really wanted the revised design of the plane, and by the late 1950s, the Air Force began retiring all models of the F-84 in favor of the F-100 Super Sabres and the F-105 Thunder Chief. Over 7,524 F-84s were produced in all of its variants and were sold to 14 different countries. It was completely retired from service in 1964 by the U.S. Air Force and served the Air National Guard into the 1970s. It also continued to serve other countries much longer. Thunderjet saw action in the colonial war in Angola until 1974, and the last Thunder Flash was retired by the Greek Air Force in 1991.